On part 2 of episode 137 of the Vincast, I chat with Alice Lestrange, the other half of Cultivar Vinos and George Wines. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Gaspbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino. And as I mentioned, this is part 2 of episode 137. If you haven't already listened to it, on the most recent release, I chatted with Lucy Kendall, who is one half of Cultivar Vinos and George Wines. And on this episode, you will hear from the other half, which is Alice Lestrange. So Alice and Lucy have been doing some amazing things, importing some beautiful, authentic Chilean wines. And over the weekend, they released officially their first Australian-made wines under the George branding. But Alice kind of has a little bit more of the sort of the Spanish language and South American cultural influences. So, on the previous release with Lucy, we chatted a little bit more about her as a winemaker and her influences on what they're doing. And I thought it would be fantastic to chat with Alice about the kind of the cultural influences on their business with Cultivar Vinos. So I hope you do enjoy the episode. Please do stick around until the end to find out how you can get in contact with us. But until then, I'll see you on the other side. Alice, thank you very much for making some time in the lead up to a very exciting launch very soon to sit down and have a chat on the Vincast. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
I start every episode by asking my guest if they can remember the first interaction they had with wine they can remember that possibly set them on a path and a passion for wine and ending up, involved in the wine industry.
That's a great question. I think for all of us, there are a few different ones. I think I'm pretty conventional in Australia as one of the first big moments being some big Coonawarra red. And I was like, whoa, this is wine. This is something that really blows my socks off. And then...
How old were you?
Probably 13, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So mum and dad?
Yeah, mum and dad, this is what wine is, because that's what they were drinking at the time.
Right.
Right now they're drinking natural booze from Chile, so
great.
Evolution happens.
Nepotism.
Yeah. Something like that. Some kind of cronyism, yeah. And then I think became quite in love with classic European wines and had actually one defining moment would have been a sauterne that I had at the Royal Mail Hotel at the very end of a degustation. And then it made me think of lavender at the time I was drinking it. And then that night I had this epic dream where I was in this field of lavender and it was just this whole sauterne thing.
Wow.
Probably the most defining one after that would have been having Anton's Savonnet at uni, and that would have been the first natural wine that I'd tasted and blew my socks off.
Was this sort of fairly early in the kind of the burgeoning natural wine scene in Australia?
Yeah, super early. I was young, and I'm still young, but it would have been about 10 years ago. Yeah, and Lucy, my business partner, and I drank it together, and we were working in sort of conventional wine at the time, retail.
Okay.
And actually we drank that bottle and then thought up the crazy idea to go to Chile or South America or something or start a wine business. We had no idea what. We were like, we should do something in wine professionally.
Right, okay. So there was that kind of profound impact that wine had.
Yeah, I'm not sure what Anton put in that wine, but we definitely got us
Hopefully grapes.
Hopefully grapes. I think it was grapes and all of the bacteria. But it definitely had a big impact on us to try something that was just wine in a very raw and authentic way that we hadn't experienced before.
Sure.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. So
whereabouts did you grow up?
Right around the corner in Ascot Vale.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And are your parents multi-generational Australians?
Yes, they are. I actually don't know a whole lot about my history. English area.
It's pretty common in Australia, actually.
Pan England. I don't know. Yeah. My great grandparents came over here, I think.
Okay. But you're hardcore northern suburbs of Melbourne?
I say west. Yeah.
West? Okay.
Yeah. West is best.
Northwest, yep.
One time I lived in Fitzroy and that was a little too far. east. So then I ran back to Footscray for about 5 years.
Okay.
No, but Victoria, I got myself from Melbourne.
Right. So growing up, did you have kind of particular passions and thought about like long term what you wanted to do when you were all grown up?
Um, I think I was always one of those kids that had absolutely no idea. And that defined me well into my mid-20s. Yeah, actually, when I met Lucy, my business partner, first day of uni, we became best buddies immediately.
What were you studying?
Arts, English lit.
Yep.
Yes.
Same here.
There you go.
And again, like I went into uni and I was like, I just want to study something I'm interested in.
Yep.
I'll figure out what I can do as far as a job later on. But I studied English literature and Japanese.
Oh, there you go. I did English lit and Spanish.
Why Spanish?
I had learnt French previously and done an exchange and all that, so I spoke that. Did my gap year there and blah blah. Developed a pretty strong, I don't say hatred, but dislike of French culture and people, just because I had a pretty rough experience in terms of how cold they can be as a peoples. And don't quote me on that because that's an awful generalization. But I remember I hopped the border to Italy and then to Spain and just experienced this immediately warm, generous, physical, touching.
It's not just
culture.
a difference in climate that they are genuinely warm, and I had the same experience like coming from Germany and Austria into Italy. You kind of just feel. You go into a piazza in Italy and you just sort of feel more warmth. People are just generally, and you see people touching each other and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I was very drawn to that type of culture.
Sure.
There's something in me that just, I felt very isolated and alone in France, and people weren't. I was used to people just going out and making friends, and it was really easy as Australian culture does that pretty well, but.
In your travels in Spain, did you find that people were more willing to kind of go out of their way to help you and
just more willing to have fun
and think that you were lost and go, oh, can I help you?
Yeah,
that
totally.
Kind of thing?
And chat and like welcome you into their friendship circles really easily.
Yeah.
And my experience of learning French was one of being criticized all the time by French people for not saying things correctly. Whereas in Italy and in Spain, it was like, oh my God, she's giving it a crack. This is amazing. And they're just like encouraging. And so then I went back, when I started uni, I jumped straight into Spanish and did French as well, but just grabbed Spanish by the balls and loved it. And then went to live in Mexico for a year. And
wow.
So that's where I got my Spanish good. And then, I think that's where I also became in love with agriculture on a small scale in the developing world and what trade means for those kinds of contexts.
Yeah.
And coming from like a love of wine and the finer good things in life and only knowing wine to be a first world to first world product, going to the third world and seeing what it was like to grow commodity crops on scale that is, smaller than I could have ever imagined was something, pretty life-changing and something that I wanted to keep pursuing.
It's something that really is missing, I think. Growing up in Melbourne, myself, like I had no kind of concept of where the food on my table was actually coming from. Like I had no idea about, farming and growing things. It was just like, that's something that generations, probably since born since maybe even like the 60s or 70s, like they're just grown up with supermarkets and stuff like that. And so,
Totally.
Farmers markets are obviously a great way to actually connect with people who are growing things and get an appreciation for that. But, even then you're still not going to the source. So it must have been pretty amazing that being, particularly in somewhere like Mexico.
Yeah. And I think you're right here. In our middle class way, our way of reconnecting with that is to go to farmers markets or grow veggies in our backyard, and it's a very a lovely thing to do, and you do it by choice. I think in the developing world, the supermarket's 1,000 times more expensive than growing it yourself, and so they have to do that and they want to, and seeing people and staying with people who grow everything that they eat by necessity and live subsistence lives was one that really impacted me in a really positive way. Like those kind of people are very, very in touch in a hand-to-mouth way with the climate. And I think, compared to what I knew of wine, it was very different. Like wine seemed to be a choice, and I know we talk a lot about vine growers as farmers and put them in that same category, but there's something very beautifully choice and, beverage product oriented around wine making. It is for me, that beautiful thing about being a human being. It is agricultural, but it's not a food product. And so
that's one of the things that I particularly love about the Italian wine culture is that by and large they still run it as a farm. Like the common term for a winery in Italy is azienda agricola.
Yeah.
So a farm, an agricultural farm.
Yeah.
And they still have olive trees and they make their own olive oil and they still run pigs or that kind of thing, and they're still sort of having it's not wine. Growing grapes for wine production was just a part of their business. It was just a part of their life, and in the obviously in the really traditional concept, it was wine was just for drinking and not necessarily for sale.
Yeah, exactly. And this is what we found in Chile as well. Like when we got there, this is jumping a few years ahead, but found that a wine was a food product and it was part of every meal, and it is part of your caloric intake, the same way that saison beer is in provincial France and that kind of thing.
I think that's one of the things that people have been really connecting with recently with Georgian wines.
Yeah, totally.
Obviously there is that amazing kind of unbroken tradition of using the qvevris and stuff like that, but that's one of the things that I like about the Georgian concept of wine is it's a family thing, and it's just it's for nourishment.
Yeah.
It's holding the wine in the qvevris on skins is trying to get as much out of the grapes as you can, and providing sustenance.
Yeah, and a funny anecdote in Chile, there's a drink that they make out of their pipeño, which means red wine. It's almost like, I don't know, some kind of a NutriBullet. It's red wine, roasted wheat flour and sugar, and you mix it up in the morning, and it's kind of like a thick pink shake. And the workers just down an entire glass of it. So you get alcohol, carbs, and sugar.
Right.
And then they run off into the vineyard, and they're fine till lunchtime. And they're just sort of... Anyway, so seeing wine used in an actual, substance way was really cool. But that's what was, I think, drew us to Chile, or me particularly, was... So, after living in Mexico and being drawn to that kind of way of living and wanting to develop relationships with these people in that trade, like I'm a firm believer in the power of business and business for good and what that can do and the direct impact that has. And so then I started working in specialty coffee as a green buyer and working for a roastery here in Melbourne, which I still do. And obviously I have a love for special beverages, but so trading with small producers growing amazing coffee beans and bringing them here and making them into amazing beverages. And I sort of didn't know, I always separated wine in my head as something very distinct from the realness of coffee. And I think that in 99% of the cases, it is incredibly distinct. But when we went to Chile to see what was going on in the south, we found subsistence grape growers who were, selling grapes below cost of production and who've been doing so for the last 5 to 10 years, but the vineyards have been in their family for 250 years. And they're making these wines that are literally feeding communities and themselves, and they can't sell them, they can't bottle them, they're forced to sell grapes. And it was a sort of a social and environmental crisis going on, which still is, and it's getting worse every day, that made me go, whoa, like this is something that I didn't know existed in the world of wine. I had this very first world perspective of what wine was, and it impacted us heavily. And tasting their wines and being like, whoa, this is exciting, energetic stuff, just made us want to start a business down there.
Okay, so we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Let's take it back to so what were you doing? You were working for the coffee roaster. Did you work in wine at all before then? Like you mentioned earlier on about wine retail.
Yeah, so while I was at uni, I was working at Black Hearts and Sparrows.
Great.
For a fair while. Luce was working at wine house.
Uh-huh.
So we had access
Down
to a
South
lot
Bank.
a lot of great European wines and a
Classic
lot of
stuff,
classic stuff. So we had, new stuff coming into our lives and black arts, and we had some, old classic palate training, and
Yeah.
Luce was doing her Wissette, and she'd just teach me everything that she was learning.
Yeah.
And then I started working for Jed wine distributors, so imports from Argentina.
Yeah. Is that kind of where you started to get a little bit more intro into the South American wines?
Yeah, totally. And we'd been to Argentina at that point as well, just on one of our uni holidays, just to see what was going on in a wine sense.
So you went to Mendoza, I'm guessing?
Yeah, we did Mendoza, we did Salta, we did, all of the...
Patagonia?
Yeah, we went down to there. We
Cool.
did quite a few different wine regions.
That's the one I didn't get to. I went to Mendoza and Salta.
Yeah, they're all fun.
Yes.
And working for Jed was great because we got to experience the entire plethora of what that country had to offer.
Sure.
And Chile to us seemed super undiscovered. Like Argentina is quite known to people, and certain parts of Chile are known to people, but we kind of heard rumors of what was going on in the south of the country and knew that area hadn't really been explored yet.
Yeah, look, it sounds like it was about that time when I was working back in retail, in independent retail, and I was being introduced to a few things from South America. You had like established importers working with, at that point, really serious producers like Catena Zapata and stuff like that. And then I remember a fringe importer and distributor had Santa Carolina, and I was like, wow, these wines are really good, and they're so cheap. They're so cheap. And of course, this is long. Then of course I went to South America and I saw, they make some amazing wines, but I never actually got the opportunity to sort of see some of these slightly more authentic. And I remember just sort of driving around Chile saying, why are they working with all these French varieties?
Totally.
Surely there must be, more Spanish varieties these wines, they're very good wines, but they could come from somewhere else.
Totally.
They could come from Australia or California or something like that.
Worldly wines. Yeah, and that's what we thought, and that's what a lot of Chileans think too. So down in the southern three valleys of Maule, Tata, and Biobío is where a lot of the original Spanish plantings still exist.
Right.
And
because the Argentina kind of context was sort of more Italian migration. Yeah. That's kind of what I got the impression.
Yeah,
particularly
exactly.
Mendoza.
Yeah. And all of their Mission grape, which is the original Spanish stuff, is pretty marginal. Torontés is one of the original ones as well. It's been a little bit adulterated over time, but they're sort of pushed north or pushed to some more marginal regions, and they've very much been influenced by post-war immigration. Chile was to a certain extent, but only focused in areas around Santiago, basically. It's pretty kind of wild west to go down south. And that big industrial industry in the middle of the country that makes a lot of that cheap box wine that we all know and love, the bulk of what they do is buy grapes from the old Spanish stuff down south, and then...
just to give them a bit more volume.
Just to give it volume, and then they take all their highly extracted and alcoholic Shiraz and Cab or whatever and blend it all into a beautiful box.
Yeah.
And that's really done a lot of damage to Chile's reputation. And we do think of South America as,
because they would look at that sort of stuff as like, oh, that's the shit stuff that we just blend in.
Totally. Or they look at it as, oh, that's what my grandpa used to make, and that's just like peasant wine. It's disgusting, and it's not export quality. It's not...
And that's the other thing I found fascinating, the difference between Chile and Argentina. Chile, there wasn't as much of a wine culture. I mean, like the more common drink you'd have in Santiago would be piscola.
Yeah, or just Coke.
Yeah.
Or beer.
Yeah, or beer, exactly. But so Chile struck me as one of those rare wine producing countries where they export vastly more than they actually drink in the country.
Much more
Whereas
so,
Argentina, in whether it's Buenos Aires or whether it's, in Mendoza, for example, they drink wine.
Totally.
They drink their own wine.
Yeah.
They drink most of their own,
but
like
it's the small
80%.
family stuff, the immigrants after World War II mostly.
Yeah.
And Chile didn't get that, and they have a very different economy. It's much more... I mean, there couldn't be two more opposite countries, really.
Yeah.
Chile's got a very open free market economy going on. Argentina's always had a lot of trouble with their economy and their monetary system, and very European way of thinking about the world. And Chile is, I mean, think of them as gringos. They're super like northern looking towards the US, and their economy speaks to that as well. So yeah, what you get in Argentina is a lot of very small family run wineries. And I suppose the harshest critique against that is that they're all doing the Bordeaux recipe. So
Malbec.
Yeah, but made like it's
international
cab
style.
or Merlot. Yeah, and it's extracted and it's boozy and it's ripe and they're very obsessed with oak.
It works with a certain market, but it's just not as exciting.
Yeah, and they have a great export market to the States. You know, they make wine to suit Robert Parker, and I think a lot of vineyards do that in Chile on a slightly larger scale, and then there's the big industrial export box wine market that Argentina doesn't really have. So I think Chile is a really complicated winemaking country in that sense, and it's interesting that you said before that you're surprised how good these wines are for so cheap, and that is true, but it's also been very damaging, and it makes it hard for us to sell like premium Chilean wines that are,
But this is exactly the same problem that Australia had in the last sort of 10 or 15 years.
Yeah.
Particularly with global financial crisis and a strong Australian dollar, and Australian wine suddenly became more expensive. And that was as South American wine producing countries and South Africa and even parts of Europe started to, their quality for inexpensive wines really started to take off, and the economies of wine production in Australia suddenly started to become a lot more expensive. And that was why, we had to start focusing more on not just premium wines, but talking about regionality and I think to a certain extent that's probably what Argentina and Chile will need to start focusing more on. I think they did get a jump start on it, but it was, as amazing as it was to get a lot of Australian wine into people's glasses around the world, Yellowtail has kind of set a precedent for Australian wine that it should be cheap, and so, but I guess the difference in Australia and Chile to a certain extent is in Australia we say we make great wines, we make world-class wines. How come the rest of the wine world doesn't appreciate that? Whereas in Chile they kind of go, we make great wine. Okay, cool. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
They're not in, and I guess it's that kind of slightly more authentic Chilean wine that they're not necessarily in touch with, and they're not, unless you are a family involved with that.
Yeah. And that's a big challenge, because the amount of growers in the south of Chile that work in the old way, work with the old varietals, and are making very authentic and historic wines. There's a handful of them that are able financially to put their wine into a 750ml bottle and put a cork in it and put a label on it. It's still a context where most people are subsistence farmers. They're peasants. They don't have a market. They don't have someone saying, please put your wine in a bottle. They have someone saying, either give me your grapes and I'll pay you below cost of production, or put your wine in a massive 5-litre gallon thing and the corner shop will buy it off you, mix it with water and sugar and sell it for 3 times more. It's a really difficult context to even get your product on the market. So,
And I guess I remember when I was at Grow Assembly a few years ago, and one of the guys from Proud Mary was talking about that kind of going to the source and going to small family-owned farms and buying coffee direct, and them sort of, when for prices we still don't think are that outrageous, and they kind of go, holy shit, the big coffee companies would never pay that much.
Totally.
And so it's kind of a similar scenario where you're actually going there and saying, okay, we want to buy your wine, and we want to help you kind of put it into a bottle that we can sell it in our market, and they're kind of going, because they probably don't have any frame of reference. They don't necessarily see wines from around the rest of the world and kind of see how their wines fit in.
Sometimes they do. So I think, actually it's a really good point, because interesting you bring up Georgia, and I think Georgia's at the natural wine fairs that our guys go to, they always see the Georgians and they all have a big party because they see themselves as very similar, coming from very sort of marginalized contexts and weird and wacky varietals no one's ever heard of, and historic wines, that kind of thing. But
it's that beautiful sort of untouched
yeah,
sort of thing that like say, well, this is how we've always done it.
But
You're
Georgia,
just discovering it now.
Yeah, and I think Georgia's benefited from really great marketing, and those wines are expensive, and they're expensive for a reason because they're hard to come by. But people expect Chilean wine to be cheap, and if our growers are selling their wines for cheap, they're not going to make business. It's not good enough. So they tell us the prices that they need, and we pay them that per bottle of wine, and that means that our wines here come in more expensively than people would otherwise think Chilean wines should be.
Mm-hmm.
And they're still, way cheaper than similar quality from Europe, but because it's a really unknown part of the world, we have struggled for people to pay what those wines actually deserve, because every restaurant only has room on their list for one Chilean wine, if that. And so I think we're making headway. Places like New York and London and even Brazil are really doing super well with all of the natural stuff from southern Chile. And I'm okay to use the word natural.
To a certain extent, these are markets where Chilean wine is fairly well established, and there's slightly more opportunities. Whereas
I think it's more about markets that are big enough that new and exciting things there's a pool of buyers big enough to make that work.
Okay.
I think Australia, we still suffer from being a small market. There's only room enough for so many people doing so many things.
Sure.
But
also we make a lot of wine in Australia too.
We make a hell of a lot of wine here. Yeah. And I don't know, so there's like maybe 5 or 6 growers that we're working with who we would sort of class as very traditional, coming from, 5 or 6 generations, or they're young guys who are working with vineyards or buying their own grapes and doing things in the old way, purposefully and as a political statement.
Mm-hmm.
And they're getting some really good fame around the world. And, they came to Rootstock, and they go to, Raw Fair and all the big things around the world. And, they've become cult figures, and their wines are amazing because these are varietals that you can't find anywhere else, and their styles are really unique.
They also get funding from
the
European Union.
Yeah, well, they get funding from the Chilean government as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know about the European Union, but
the Georgians.
The Georgians do, yeah. So the Chileans have to apply for funding and blah blah blah.
Okay.
And, we've had some of our guys miss out on coming here because they couldn't get funding, and it's bureaucratically they don't make it easy. But I think it's something that I see taking off because we're representing a product that has a social and environmental impact that other countries can't offer a consumer. And I think from my perspective, there are so many people that want to drink wine not for the traditional reasons, not because it tastes like this, or because it's has this many points, or because it's from this famous region. They want to drink something that's healthy and good for them and that has an interesting story behind it. So I do see that crossing all sorts of food products, and people wanting to get in touch with who grew their carrots is the same as wanting to know who made your wine and how do they make it and what do they put into it and where did it come from and what kind of farming is going on. And I think the social context in the south of Chile is something really important to support and to help thrive, because if these guys can't continue to grow grapes, then their vineyards get ripped up and planted out to pine or eucalypt plantations, and that destroys communities and it destroys soils. So there's this urgency and crisis going on that kind of, for Luce and I, keeps us in it. It's like a burning fire to want to really push this stuff and be able to buy more from people. And we've got this sort of long-term project because there's so many amazing winemakers, generational winemakers down there who don't put their wines into bottles and never have. Like a lot of our 6th or 7th generation growers, they're the first person in that line to put a wine in a bottle. So there's so much opportunity there if we can provide that infrastructure or funding to get wine from their pipa or wherever they store it into a bottle and export it or whatever. I mean, sadly, Santiago doesn't provide much of a market for old school wines. But there's so much unexplored territory there, and there's an urgency to do it as well because people are ripping up vineyards every day. And
well, there was also they had fires.
The fires, well, last year and the year before, it was massive, ripped through the entire region. And I mean, people do blame the forestry industry down there. It's one of the most incredibly massive forestry industries I've ever seen, and I think that exists in the world. And was a really hot drought period and machine sparks and things, and then you've just got a vast, sprawl of pine and eucalypt that just went up in flames, and wildfire and vineyards lost, and a lot of our growers lost 250-year-old vines, and it's very, very tragic.
So as far as the original conception of Cultivar, you'd been to Chile already. Had you discovered some of these wines? How did you kind of first? So the introduction to natural wine came first.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
Had you been to Chile before that?
No, we hadn't.
How did you hear about these kind of traditional Chilean wines?
We had this feeling that there should be something cool going on in South America.
Okay.
We were just like, I reckon there's something awesome going down because we don't see anything on the market, but there's got to be something really cool.
Yeah.
And then so we went to Argentina. We're like, yeah, it's okay. Like good wines, solid, really nice winemaking tradition, but nothing that really
still a little bit more commercial.
Yeah, and we didn't really come across winemakers who were pushing boundaries. And
they were actually from there?
They were actually from there, exactly. Or that weren't, just contracting Michel Rolland to come in and tell them exactly.
Yeah, or had gone to, study in Bordeaux or something.
Yeah, boring town. And then the year after that, we went to Chile and we went to the Casablanca Valley. And we'd heard of this kind of rogue Chilean winemaker doing BD Pinot, and his name is Julio Donoso, and he was a photographer for Vogue in Paris back in the day, and an amazing dude. He's actually coming here this month, and he put us in touch with another French winemaker who was needing vintage assistance, and Lucy, my partner, is a trained winemaker and viticulturist and has been making wine for wineries around the world for years now. So I was her little tag along, and we worked vintage for Emeric, and it was my first vintage. This was back in 2015, and yeah, it was a hard slog working for a French man in Chile who didn't like Chile or Chileans at all, and didn't really ever speak. He just yelled. I
think I met a couple of Frenchmen like that.
Yeah, seemed to be a few floating around. Anyway, so we worked for minimum wage, and with the condition that we were allowed to make wine ourselves in a corner of his winery using his equipment. And we found this vineyard. So there's still a lot of old pais up in Casablanca region as well. So we found a vineyard that was about 150 years old, and it was one of those traditional bush planted, very wide spacing. The vines had been there for a long time. They had a lot of intercrossing within the vineyard because the red grape pais does that naturally. It crosses and mutates very easily, almost like Pinot does. So you go into these vineyards and you see all shades of different coloured grapes, and there's nothing really, varietal about it at all. So we handpicked and we paid them, really high prices for their grapes, which we didn't think were that high at all. And I think like $1 a kilo or something. And yeah, we had fun making natural wine in this Frenchman's winery, and he'd come along and turn his nose up at what we were doing, and Pais looked down on it as one of those peasant non-noble grapes, nothing like the French. He's a very Rhone man. I don't know, and I think that was the first time Liz and I had made wine together, and it was just an incredible experience of being under duress, working for a crazy person, and like having a little baby to nurture. So we got Pais, and then we needed more volume because it was a small vineyard, and so we got some organic Syrah. So we thought, we're Australian Shiraz, let's do a Shiraz Pais, and we made a wine and called it Hey Hermano because watching a lot of Arrested Development at the time. And I think that's when we were like, fuck, like making wine's also a thing. This is brilliant. And so then after seeing that vineyard of Pais and asking around and learning there was a bit of a cult revolution thing going on in the South where all of the Pais was, and that there were some pretty awesome figures just making rogue wines and, basically saying this to putting the finger up at the commercial wine industry. And so we saved up our dollars again, went back again the next year and spent about 3 or 4 months in the South just traveling around and meeting anybody and everybody that we could associated with anything to do with natural wine down there. And And I use the word natural wine for down there because that's what they call it. Like they very clearly define what they're doing as natural, as opposed to what's going on in the middle of the country, which is a very unnatural way of growing anything. We just fell in love. They're just such amazing people, and we always wanted to create a people-focused business. And you know, that the wines be tasting delicious is great and a given, but we needed to like and want to support the lives of who we were working with. And it was kind of pretty easy to tell who was in it for the right reasons and who was just exploiting or, you know, getting on the natural wine bandwagon. And it was eye-opening to see this amazing type of viticulture that neither of us had ever seen before in, you know, 200-year-old vines that have never been irrigated, they've never been trellised, they've never been sprayed, anything. It was just wow. And the fruit quality that you get from those grapes is balanced beyond belief. And so for us to, you know, make wine without any additions or anything like that was just the easiest thing to do in the world. And it's what keeps drawing us back there.
And so you put together a kind of a mini portfolio of producers there. Did you have, did you kind of freak out and go, God, now we're going to work out how we're going to sell these back at home?
Yeah, that is still the freak out, as I think any importer would attest to. But the thing is, with Chile, no one's exporting in a reefer, really, and definitely no one's doing LCL. So we had to, if we wanted to export in a reefer, which we did because a lot of our wines are zero sulfur, a refrigerated container, then we had to fill it because, you know, the cost of doing that was really high. And so we brought quite a lot of wine in and we had to really set about selling that, and it was a totally new thing on the market. And we were like just so lucky that there were a handful of great somms around the country who really appreciated what was going on and who put our stuff on the pour instantly and just, it made us feel like, phew, you know, like we're not the only ones who think this is important.
Yeah. Somms have a tendency to kind of really get excited about something new and different and something that they can introduce people to and say, oh my God, have you tried some of these awesome wines coming out of the south of Chile? Yeah, and, you know, I'll talk to just punters and they're like, almost like, oh, you poor things, like you got Chilean wine, like where do you sell it? And I'll, you know, list some amazing restaurants. They're like, oh my God, you've got your wines there. I was like, yeah, we've got our wines there because these are really smart people, like, who think outside the box, and that's why their venues are so amazing. And so we're fighting a whole lot of odd misconceptions about Chile from all of the angles. But I think as soon as you try the stuff and you sort of feel the energy, it's pretty easy to keep going. And I think we're quite lucky in that, unlike Georgia, the price is accessible. Sure. And the styles are accessible as well. They're not as like skin contact driven whites as Georgia is. And they're pretty fresh and lively and just kind of easy to drink a lot of. And it's affordable to do so as well. And I can imagine Australians have a little bit less of a hard time pronouncing the names.
Totally, yeah, I think so too.
Pace is a little bit easier to say than I'm sorry, I'm terrible at it. Anyway,
although we do get a lot of people saying like pepinos or papaya for pipeño, which is like the style of wine. But yeah, like the terminology is hard for people to get their head around.
Well, look, I have really enjoyed having the opportunity to taste some of these beautiful wines you've been bringing in, awesome. And I'm looking forward to tasting more. Particularly next week. Yeah. But look, I want people to get behind the awesome stuff that you guys are doing as far as identifying and bringing in these really, really cool wines from Chile. Do you want to let people know where they can find out more about the Chilean wines and you know, hopefully where they can buy them and social media accounts?
Of course. So our website is cultivarwines.com.au. Our Instagram is Cultivar Vinos, so Vinos. You can get in touch with us via there or via the website if you want to buy wine from us. But the best place to look is Black Hearts and Sparrows, drinks.com, Cult of the Vine has a lot of our stuff. And then if you want to have it by the glass, places like Neighborhood Wine and Igni and Embler and all of the lovely places around Melbourne are usually pouring them. Laser Pig has one of our orange wines at the moment, which is really fun. Yeah, I'm surprised at the variety of venues that have been like interested to give something different a crack, and
Awesome.
and how wide the client pool can be, or the type. Yeah, it's been pretty cool. But in a retail sense, yeah, blackartsdrinks.com and Cultivar Vinos is where we're retailing at the moment.
Fantastic. Alice, thank you very much
Thank
for
you, James.
making some time, and yeah, looking forward to pouring some wine next week.
Excellent, me too. It's gonna be great.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us on this episode of the Vincast. I have been James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and you can find me on social media on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. I'm at Intrepid Wino, and you can find the podcast on Twitter at the Vincast. Please check out my YouTube channel, Intrepid Wino, one word, where there's lots of different videos, including my series called Let's Taste, where we'll be releasing my Let's Taste video of the George wines very soon. Subscribe, make sure you like some of the videos, comment, share them on social media. I'd love to hear from you there. You can find the podcast on a number of different platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Player FM, Podbean, iHeartRadio, hopefully soon Spotify, and the Google podcast app, whatever that might be. Subscribing to the podcast means you get the newest episode as soon as it becomes available. You can also access the entire back catalogue, but also those platforms are a great way to provide some feedback to myself, to other listeners, and also to the guests by leaving a rating and a review, and that also helps the podcast get out to a bigger audience. I really do appreciate everyone who takes the time to leave me a review, so thank you for those who already have. Of course, all that information is available on my website, intrepidwino.com, as well as different ways of getting in contact with me. I'd love to hear from you. If there's someone you'd love to hear on the podcast, let me know. If there's an episode you enjoyed in particular, let me know. I really, really do appreciate people who get in contact with me. I've got lots more great episodes coming up soon, so until then, bye.
Earbuds, Melbourne's podcast network. earbudsnetwork.com